The moment a drill sergeant snapped to attention in front of me and barked, "General? Ma'am?" right in front of my shocked family, I knew my journey had come full circle. But that moment didn't happen by luck or even by plan. It happened because I dared to fail, loudly, publicly, and unapologetically. My name is Jenna Carter, and I'm 29 years old. I used to be the family disappointment, the one who didn't follow the path, who flunked out of college, and couldn't hold a steady job. But what no one saw coming was how that path, the messy, winding one, led to a salute I'll never forget. I was always the creative one in the family, code for unfocused and impractical. My younger sister, Michelle, was the golden girl, straight A's, ROTC captain, and Ivy League bound. I, on the other hand, dropped out of community college after 3 semesters and bounced between gigs that barely covered rent. Every holiday dinner, I felt like I needed a resume just to justify my seat at the table. What none of them knew was that my failures were building something beneath the surface. After a string of retail jobs, I landed a part-time admin role at a local veterans nonprofit. It didn't pay much, but something about it felt right. I wasn't wearing a uniform, but I was helping men and women who had. I listened to their stories. I organized paperwork. Eventually, I started writing small grant proposals and coordinating events. I felt useful for the first time in years, but something bigger began to stir inside me, and I didn't know what it meant. Yet one afternoon, a Vietnam vet named Howard leaned across his desk and said, "You know, you'd make one hell of an officer." I laughed so hard I almost spilled my coffee. Me? An officer? I had barely passed Algebra 101, but the idea stuck. I researched what it would take to join the military, not as an enlistee, but as an officer. The requirements were steep, and I didn't meet most of them. No degree, no ROTC, no direction. But there was a loophole few knew about. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up reading every detail of the direct commission path. Over the next 6 months, I re-enrolled in college. This time with purpose. I studied organizational leadership and enrolled in a hybrid program while continuing to work at the nonprofit. I kept my plans quiet, especially from my family. I didn't want their doubts to become mine, but life didn't let me move quietly. For Michelle's basic training graduation, I flew down to Fort Jackson with the rest of the family. I was proud of her, truly, but I could already hear the side comments about my own stalled life. As we sat on the bleachers, our dad leaned over and said, "Maybe watching this will light a fire under you." Little did he know, it already had. After the ceremony, we were allowed a few minutes to mingle with the recruits. Michelle introduced us to her drill sergeant, a tall, chiseled man with a presence that could silence thunder. When he reached me, he looked twice, his eyes narrowed, and then widened. "You're Carter's sister?" he asked. I nodded, wondering if I'd somehow gotten Michelle in trouble. That he straightened instantly and barked, "General?" "Ma'am," and gave me a crisp salute. Everyone froze, including Michelle. I nearly dropped my purse. I tried to laugh it off, but he didn't budge. "Forgive me, ma'am. I didn't recognize you at first. You were at the Veteran Leadership Summit last month, weren't you?" And just like that, my family's jaws dropped. The truth was, through my nonprofit work and academic program, I had been selected as a speaker at a military leadership event, one that many officers and NCOs attended, including, apparently, this drill sergeant. He had seen me on stage delivering a talk about strategic veteran reintegration, and I hadn't even known. Suddenly, my so-called failure became a badge of honor in his eyes. After the salute, my father blinked and said, "What was that?" And I said the words I'd been waiting to say my entire life. "I guess you could say I've been busy building my own path." But that moment was just the beginning of what came next. Word spread quickly. The sergeant invited me to join the senior officers' lounge, normally off limits to civilians. There, I met a colonel who asked if I'd considered taking on a leadership role at the Department of Defense's Civilian Advisory Board. 2 months later, I was on a plane to DC. I didn't become a general, at least not in the military sense, but I became something just as commanding. Through my work, I helped shape policies for veteran affairs, advised congressional subcommittees, and eventually launched my own nonprofit consultancy that supported military families. And then came the recognition I never expected. I was awarded the Civilian Medal of Honor for Exceptional Public Service, one of the highest honors given to a civilian by the U.S. military. My name was announced in a room full of medals, ribbons, and stars. And when I stood up to receive it, I looked out and saw my sister in full dress uniform, standing and clapping harder than anyone. She mouthed the words, "That's my sister." Funny how it was never about outranking anyone, but about standing tall in the life I had created. I remember sitting with my mom after the ceremony. She held my hand and whispered, "We didn't know how to support you before. I'm so sorry for that." It was the apology I didn't know I needed, but the most meaningful moment came the day Michelle called me, not as a sister, but as a fellow leader. She'd been assigned to a new base and was nervous about leading her first command unit. "I don't think I'm ready," she said. I told her exactly what I wish someone had told me all those years ago. "You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to show up as yourself." There's a strange power in failing in front of the people who doubt you, because when you rise, they never forget it. Now, when our family gets together, the conversation shifts. They ask about my latest policy initiative, my trips to Capitol Hill, or my keynote at a military gala. No one talks about college transcripts or retail jobs anymore, and it's not because I became someone else, it's because I finally let myself become me. Every time someone calls me ma'am now, I smile, not out of ego, but out of memory, because once, I was the girl who didn't finish her degree. The one who couldn't explain her dreams clearly enough to be believed. The one who stayed up late wondering if she'd ever make her family proud. And now, I'm the woman who commands attention from drill sergeants, who stands in rooms once closed to her, who listens to stories from soldiers and reminds them that leadership comes in many forms, even from the family of failure. But what came next wasn't just about medals or meetings. It was about moments, the kind that make you pause and realize how far you've come. One of those moments came when I was invited to speak at a youth leadership summit for high school girls from underfunded communities. I wore a navy pantsuit, not a uniform, but the respect in their eyes made me stand taller than any badge ever could. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Did you always know you'd be successful?" I smiled and told her the truth. No, I only knew I didn't want to disappear. They leaned in as I told them about failing, about being laughed at behind closed doors, about the awkward family dinners where I felt like the other daughter. I told them how success didn't come in a straight line, and it certainly didn't come overnight, but I left out something that still stung too deeply to say out loud. You see, even with all the validation, the awards, and the respect, I still felt that shadow of early rejection trailing me. The years when people assumed I was lazy or directionless had left a mark. But scars don't mean you're broken. They mean you've healed, and I was finally starting to heal in ways I didn't expect. A few months later, Michelle and I collaborated on something we never saw coming, a joint mentorship program. She came to me with the idea, nervous like a kid asking a big favor. What if we did something together? Civilians and active duty personnel learning from each other? It was brilliant. And it was hers. I helped her structure it, design the rollout, and get it funded. Within a year, we had 24 pairs of military leaders and civilians shadowing one another, learning about empathy, adaptability, and leadership beyond the uniform. But the best part? Watching my sister shine in her own way, standing next to me, not behind or ahead. One evening, after a particularly emotional debrief session with our participants, she looked at me and said, "I used to feel sorry for you, you know. But now, I just feel proud." The words hit me in a way no medal ever could. Around that time, our family started treating our relationship differently. My dad, the man who once joked about me maybe getting a fire lit under me, now forwarded my op-eds to his friends with the subject line, "My daughter wrote this." I overheard him once, on the phone with a coworker, saying, "She's a real changemaker. Works with the government. High-level stuff." It almost made me cry. Mom, too, started asking real questions. Not the kind laced with quiet judgment, but the curious ones, the ones that said, "I want to understand you better." It was new territory for us. Soft, human, real. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore, but receiving it felt like finally letting out a breath I'd been holding since I was 19. At the full circle moment, though, the one that stitched everything together, came on Veterans Day last year. I was invited to speak at a ceremony in our hometown. The local high school auditorium was packed. Banners waved. Kids fidgeted in seats while their parents took photos. I stood backstage with a thick folder of notes, wondering if I should try to sound more formal, more military. Then I saw her, Michelle, standing in uniform, in the front row. She gave me a thumbs up and mouthed, "Be you." And I did. I told the crowd about failure, about grit, about the strange and winding roads that bring us home. I told them how sometimes leadership doesn't come from a title or a rank, it comes from knowing who you are when no one else does. When I stepped off stage, a group of high school seniors surrounded me. One girl with a messy bun and ripped sneakers looked at me and asked, "Do you think it's okay if I don't have it all figured out yet?" I took her hand and said, "That's where the real story begins." It still surprises me how often people ask for my story now, when for so long no one wanted to hear it, but I never mind telling it, because every time I do, I remind myself, Of something I once needed to hear, that it's okay to be the late bloomer, that your timeline is not a failure, it's a blueprint written in invisible ink, that sometimes, the people who look lost are the ones carving new paths. I still keep that drill sergeant's words in a small frame on my desk. General? Ma'am? Not because of the rank, but because of the recognition. Because in that one stunned moment, someone saw me as more than the sum of my past. He saw who I had become, but even with everything I'd accomplished, I hadn't yet told anyone the truth about the darkest part of my journey until Michelle asked me one night over coffee. We were sitting on my apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker beneath us like a constellation that had fallen to earth. She was in town for training and crashed on my couch, something we hadn't done since we were teenagers. Between sips of coffee, she asked softly, what was the hardest part of it all? It took me a moment to answer, because my throat caught. With memories, it wasn't dropping out, or being broke, or even feeling lost. I finally said, it was sitting at the dinner table with all of you and pretending I was okay. Michelle's eyes filled, and she nodded without saying anything. For the first time, I knew she didn't see me as her complicated sister anymore. She saw me as a woman who had fought her own war, just without the camouflage, and yet, that battle gave me my strongest weapon, empathy. Later that year, I was invited to consult on a joint civilian-military leadership simulation, a multi-day event that brought together everyone from CEOs to combat veterans. My job was to bridge the gap. The military leaders operated like a chain of command. The civilians were collaborative, flexible, and often chaotic. It was like watching two worlds try to share the same oxygen. But on the final day, a Marine colonel pulled me aside. Ma'am, I didn't think this kind of collaboration could actually work. But you made it make sense. You speak both languages. That sentence stayed with me because that's exactly what my journey had taught me, how to speak both languages. The language of structure and the language of soul. The language of command and the language of compassion. And I realized something even bigger. Maybe this was my purpose all along. That realization led me to launch a new initiative called the Mission Within, a leadership fellowship for young women who'd felt overlooked, underestimated, or just lost. We started small, 10 women, one shared cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and a 5-day immersive retreat filled with storytelling, hiking, workshops, and silence. No phones. No expectations. Just women rediscovering their voices. On the last night, we sat around a fire, and one girl, Julia, shared that she had been told she wasn't leadership material because she cried during group projects. Another said she was laughed at when she said she wanted to be an aerospace engineer. I looked around at their raw faces glowing in the firelight, and I said, don't wait for someone else to validate you. You're not too emotional. You're not too much. You're powerful exactly as you are. And for the first time, I saw my younger self in every single one of them. A year later, one of those girls was standing at a White House event as a youth delegate for STEM policy. Another launched her own podcast. A third enlisted in the Air Force, after writing her own terms for how she'd served. I keep their photos on my office wall, not as trophies, as reminders that failure is never the end of the story, it's the start of your voice and mine. It grew louder the more people tried to silence it. The last time my entire family gathered, Michelle made a toast. Not to her promotion, not to her transfer, but to me. It was Thanksgiving. The table was full, and the food was barely touched. She stood up, glass in hand, and said, I used to think leadership was all about rank, but watching my sister lead, in her own way, has taught me that strength doesn't always wear stripes. Everyone clapped, but my dad stood in silence, staring at me with this strange look I couldn't decode. After dinner, he pulled me aside on the porch. He fidgeted with his wedding ring the way he always did when nervous. I don't say this stuff often, he began, but I was wrong. You didn't fail. You just took a longer road. And I'm proud of you. I think I cried more that night than I had in years, because it wasn't just approval. It was release. Now, every time I walk into a new boardroom or training center or summit stage, I carry the little girl who once hid her report cards under her bed. I carry the Jenna who was mocked by her own relatives, ignored in job interviews, and called directionless by guidance counselors. But I also carry the woman who stood on a stage while a drill sergeant saluted her, the woman who built something out of broken pieces, the woman who didn't give up, because something inside her whispered, keep going. And that whisper was louder than the world's doubts. So yes, my family once said I failed. But now they call me first for advice. They quote my speeches. They send me articles with sticky notes that say, thought of you. And every time someone asks me how I got here, I say, I failed. And then I found myself, and there's no rank higher than that.